Okay, good. We're going to have such a good discussion, a really important discussion. And of course, we're meeting in very important times, and probably this issue around migration is one of the biggest issues that this new incoming government has got to face. It's probably one of the most difficult issues. We've got a great panel to discuss it. So let me introduce the panel to you. We've got Tony Vaughan, MP. We've got Chris Murray, MP. We've got Mubin Buttar, Director of Policy Research and Advocacy at the British Red Cross. We've also got Marley Morris, who is Associate Director for Migration, Trade and Communities here at the IPPR, and I am Chair, Aisha Hazarika. So look, I think we're going to hear lots of different views. We're going to try and leave time for questions. But I suppose the key things for us just to sort of consider through this panel is, with migration, along with the economy, there's such important issues, and there is definitely an argument for this new Labour government to talk about the inheritance. Absolutely, when you look at the failed Rwanda scheme, when you look at the cost of the failed migration and the broken migration process. So that is an area where Labour, talking about the inheritance, talking about the Conservative Party, it does have traction because people believe that to be true. However, as the late great John Smith said, we only ask for the opportunity to serve. The Labour Party really wanted to win this election so that we could collectively fix Britain. So on the one hand, yes, this is an area where we can talk about the inheritance, but very quickly the public will be looking towards us to fix some of that. It's not an overnight fix, but they will be wanting. And certainly when I do my radio show, I would say my listeners are very mixed. There's very progressive listeners, but there are also many of my listeners who are probably right of centre who are worried about immigration, but they thought the Rwanda scheme was like completely sort of ridiculous. But the question that they will be asking is, when are we likely to see some kind of metrics? And I think the other thing for Labour, which is, it's a difficult sort of balance politically, because there are really important, loved, progressive members of our movement who will want to be pushing the Labour leadership for a more compassionate view on immigration, things like safe and legal routes and lots of other things. On the other hand, there's also going to be wings of the party and indeed strategists who are going to be really worried about the rise of reform and things like that. So I'd say this is an area which is it's so important, and it's so difficult as well, and it's so difficult to sort of get it right. But we've got some real experts on the panel, and we're going to sort of go through this. We're going to sort of look at some of the issues, safe and legal routes. What do we think are the priorities for a kind of a new reformed asylum system? How should the Home Office work with devolved administrations, and how does devolution play a role in all of this as well? And of course, other issues about this, cultural issues, practical issues as well, and finances as well. So lots to get going with. So we're going to start by, our panelists going to do 5 minutes, and then we're going to chat, and then we'll try and leave plenty of time for questions. So Tony, can I ask you to kick things off?
Great, well, thanks very much for having me. I'm just going to set my timer because I know that I will otherwise go over. Hi everyone, I'm Tony. I'm a new MP at Folkestone and Hyde, a coastal community and right next to Dover. So I lived in a house where small boats had turned up at the end of essentially up at the end of the garden. People in Folkestone and Hyde are a diverse interesting cross section of the community, the national community. As was said a moment ago, there's a very wide coalition of people that Labour has to bring with them. It's Reform voters and Tory-leaning voters, which we have in a place called Bromley Marsh, particularly. They are spread, but there is a concentration of them in that area. Folkestone is overall, it's a Green-led council. So you have a group of people who are pressing for progressive immigration policy. And then you have sort of One Nation Tories who are sort of somewhat pragmatic, but culturally uncomfortable with people just turning up unannounced votes. And so I managed to get a majority of 3,700. The first time ever, I should say, in that area, Michael Howard. By the way. But it shows you that it's a culturally conservative place, and it's a kind of place that Labour bears in mind when it's making its policy on this issue. But look, I'm going to start on the inheritance, because we do have to start with the inheritance, because we should never forget that we have inherited an asylum policy that's about gimmicks, it's about performative cruelty, and it's about waste. And we must never ever forget that or allow them to forget that. The Rwanda policy, totally immoral, totally unworkable, and a massive waste of money. 320 million, I think they spent by July. I think it was going to cost 700 million by the time it kicked off. If it was going to kick off, and so let's not forget that, because that is a monumental failure that was entirely designed to create a massive backlog of people who would never be processed. That's what we have a sort of second aspect of this. They just deliberately decided not to decide claims, let the claims pile up, and in the process created a millions and millions of pounds of asylum accommodation that needed to be paid for. Now, when we talk about the 20 billion black hole, 6 billion of that is the asylum system, and a lot of that is asylum accommodation. And so this was a self-made problem solely to give the impression, so they thought, of being tough, of having a gimmick that they thought people would like. In my view, totally ridiculous, totally fair. So look, Labour's absolutely right to go in and scrap Rwanda. He's totally right to end the retrospective application of the Illegal Migration Act, which essentially pressed the pause button as at March 2023 for any asylum claim, which was then put in a pile, that people then left to just wait without having any processing done whatsoever. They're right, in order to process those claims, to have recruited thousands of caseworkers. You can't decide the claims without having Home Office caseworkers to do it. And we're right to close the Bibby Stockholm barge, a visible symbol of that performative cruelty that we saw under the Tories, gone, quite rightly. We have opened a route for Afghan families to come. The new route who had been connected with the Taliban vacating, the Taliban comes to power in Afghanistan. And we've also, of course, launched Border Security Command, which is going to be the start of giving National Crime Agency counter-terrorism style powers to try to hit smuggling gangs. And that is an entirely right approach. You've got to deal with the fact that that is industrial scale human smuggling and trafficking. And sometimes people don't like the emphasis on that particular aspect of the policy. But in my view, having worked with victims of smuggling and trafficking for many, many years, is absolutely necessary to start by actually, yes, smashing the gang, because they are responsible for the massive increase in numbers that we see coming across the channel, giving people false hope, creating increasingly large vessels which are unsafe, resulting in the deaths that we see. And look, it's we've got 15 seconds on the future. I mean, look, we're going to come to it in a minute, I'm sure. But we need the whole system to be pragmatic and fair and humane. And one of the most important things about Labour coming to power has been the reinstatement of the rule of law and the primacy of the rule of law and human rights underpinning our policy. And that's important because we have to test every policy proposal that comes out against those benchmarks, but also the principle of pragmatism, about going down the road of what works and not being kind of wedded to ideas which perhaps don't work. And compliance with international law is right at the heart of all of that. But I'll stop there, and I'm sure we're going to explore all those issues in later depth.
Brilliant, thanks very much. Your perspective, particularly the constituency that you've just won. And it is interesting, as you see, in terms of things that have already started. One thing that's really struck me is that Keir Starmer is already, resetting Britain's relationship with a lot of international partners, because this is something that we cannot do alone. And it's interesting, quite controversial, but he did go to sort of Italy. We had that meeting with Millennial. So this is obviously, you know, part of the kind of international reset. Migration is a big feature of that. Well, let's now hear from Chris Murray. And Chris, you know, give us your thoughts, but maybe we could like pivot a bit to sort of the future a little bit in terms of you know, what we might expect or what you would like to see happen.
Yeah, well, firstly, thank you so much for having me here. I'm afraid it's day 3 of conference and my voice is beginning to give out. So I don't normally sound this husky every 30 minutes, so sorry about that. I think like just picking up firstly on what Tony was saying there, it is really important that we take stock of the really significantly difficult inheritance we've inherited on immigration policy from the last government. So I've spent the last 15 years working on immigration policy throughout the whole time of the Tory government. And I thought it was bad under Theresa May, but then we went through Priti Patel and Stella Braverman and then on to the Rwanda scheme. And it has just been like really worse than we could have imagined. And now we're in government, we're seeing that. So the parallel, you know, we talk about the economic inheritance and how actually I'm going to be honest with people about resolving the deep structural challenges. All options on the sorting the system out actually involves some pain to get through to a secure economy. But I would say on immigration, we're in the same place. When you look at the asylum backlog, there are some really difficult choices facing the government on how you clear that. You don't just like click your fingers and the problem solved. So if you move that huge amount of people onto either you grant them asylum, they then will immediately or very swiftly lose the local authority of their asylum accommodation. And a lot of them will present at local authorities in great need. You know, these are asylum seekers, and local authorities have a statutory duty to, you know, look for, you know, protect children, protect adults with social care needs, and do so on the basis of need. That is really, really difficult to pull off when you look at the state of our local authorities after 14 years of Tory austerity. How you manage that is really hard. And we've kind of, more broadly on the immigration system, got into a doom loop in the UK. So the economy is in a doom loop under the Tories because you've got low growth, high taxation, and poor public services. Really hard to turn that around. On immigration, you've got a system that doesn't work for the economy. Immigration is the highest it's ever been, and the economy is still really struggling. It doesn't work for communities who are seeing their really serious integration challenges or difficulties. And it also doesn't work with the migrants who are going through that system, who really struggle to access not just the services they need or the jobs they need, but the sort of quality of life that they need as well. So I think that there's really, really wicked challenges that we face in coming to terms with those options. And that it's actually the first step the Labour government has to do is be honest with people and honest with not just the asylum sector, but, you know, key industries who, universities who want to recruit more students, or employers who want to bring in more migrants. We'll be honest about these challenges cannot be fixed. Like, you know, in the stroke of a pen or opening a couple of visa routes. It's much more systemic than that. And I think like the one thing I would say as well about the immigration challenge more broadly, you know, things like safe routes and things like, you know, things like the Rwanda scheme sounded very appealing to a certain demographic of the population who wanted to believe it was easy to solve these challenges. And we need to make sure, I think, as progressives, that we don't replicate that dynamic, although it's from a progressive side of it. So I think like the discussion around safe routes, we have had safe routes in the UK asylum system really already. You know, if you think about the Hong Kong scheme or the Ukrainian scheme, those were safe routes for people from essentially places where they're facing persecution. But the issue is we just picked nationalities that we wanted to offer to. We didn't with other nationalities. Oh, sorry, you asked me to speak closer to the microphone. Sorry. So that's quite problematic. And the Rwanda scheme was really flawed because what it said to people was, you can try and come, but there's a 1% chance we'll send you to Rwanda, so don't risk it. And clearly that was never going to work. But safe routes replicates that dynamic in the sense that there's a 1% chance we'll pick you and you can come. So the point is we have to see the immigration system in the round. You know, it's going to involve deterrence, working upstream, working with integration in communities, working on safe routes, working on removal, and working with a border security command. That's like so important that was one of the first things that the Home Office and the Red Cooper announced. And on that, I would just say as a final point, you know, someone who's the last 5 years I've spent working with the victims of trafficking in Scotland. And I think we really have to be, it's really important that we're not naive about the scale of the exploitation that is going on of vulnerable people, and that the immigration system actually, you know, creates the circumstances in which that exploitation can take place. And we've got to be really clear about how you break that apart. I think we'll probably come on to talk about how we work with our European neighbours, how we work, you know, in international institutions, how we talk about human rights. But we can't only focus on that and not on preventing the exploitation that's taking place in communities right across the country, in all parts, both sex trafficking and labour trafficking, which we have really not focused on in the UK in recent years. I can see my time is already up, but there's a lot of difficult challenges ahead facing the new government, and the inheritance is really, really difficult, but we have to be honest about what those challenges imply in terms of our decisions.
Congratulate Chris on becoming a very new Scottish MP. Of course, look, we're talking about really difficult, gloomy stuff here, but it is important to remind ourselves that, you know, Labour had a fantastic win in July, absolutely superb. You know, I'm always struck by the history, and you look at the facts, and in the whole of British history, there's only ever been 7 Labour prime ministers, only 7 Labour prime ministers, and of those only 4 have ever won an election. So as a man once said, this is no time for sound bites, but I feel the history, history on my shoulder. But of course, the result in Scotland was absolutely phenomenal, and many of you will know that Labour was really in the wilderness in Scotland for a long time. There's only one Labour MP. Chris Murray. There were more pandas in Edinburgh Zoo than there were MPs at one point. And Ian Murray, who is he was the one Labour MP for a long time, and he clung on, and he's now the Scottish Secretary, which is fantastic. But I did say to him, what is the best thing, Ian, about having all these new Labour MPs? And he was like, Secret Santa's going to be so much more fun. So, right, let's now hear from Mubin Bhutta, who is Head of Policy, Research and Advocacy at the Red Cross, where she oversees the delivery of its external affairs, and it's going to be very interesting to hear what you've got to say.
First challenge, I don't think this was.
Oh, why don't you use this ceremony? Try and speak quite close to it.
Okay. All right, is that working?
Can we hear that? Testing 1, 2, 3. Well, you can hear me, but you speak.
Okay. Does it sound okay?
Yeah.
Okay. So nice to see you all. I just wanted to start by introducing a little bit about the work of the British Red Cross. We are an auxiliary to the government, which means that we have an official role in providing services, and we've got a long history of working with the government on addressing humanitarian needs of refugees and people seeking asylum. We are the largest independent provider of TXC in the UK. Last year we supported over 14,000 people. The support that we provide covers a range of things, including casework, cash-based assistance to people facing destitution, and travel assistance to people who are reuniting with families. Family being a technical part of our mandate as well. And we are part of the world's largest humanitarian movement, the International Red Crescent movement, which is 191 national societies, International Committee, International Federation of the Red Cross and Red Crescent, which just gives us that kind of international insight, which informs our work after that. As we've already heard, kind of building a fair and compassionate asylum system is a big challenge. So kind of perhaps like other speakers, we focus on kind of the immediate challenges where we are now, and they need to kind of get to grips with some of those long-term issues in the system, particularly the backlog that you already had. There are currently over 100,000 people waiting for an initial decision on their asylum claim. And some of that backlog has grown because of the sheer number of policy announcements we've had in recent years. Kind of decided to grown that backlog, and obviously we welcome the commitment that we've had since the election to tackle that backlog. But there's also a decision problem with kind of appeals in terms of decision making. So the backlog is in different places of lockdowns in different parts of the system. And as we've already heard, while people are waiting for those decisions, they are in asylum accommodation, including hotels. They're unable to work and they're reliant on asylum support, which is £1.27 a day. And we see every day the enormous cost of accommodating people in hotels, the humanitarian impact that has. People with vulnerabilities such as survivors of torture, sexual abuse, being forced to share a room with people that they don't know for years. It's really problematic. It means people are more likely to struggle to integrate, more likely to have mental health struggles, and less likely to have the resilience to rebuild their lives within the asylum system. So leaving people in the situation is not humanitarian. Sorry. It's a bit complex. Yeah. So yes, we've already heard about that not being a good use of public money, it's also not humanitarian. So the government has been in power for just less than 3 months. We've seen some positive changes that we really welcome already. The commitment to end the use of hotels, barges and former military sites as asylum accommodation is really vital to deliver that, but it goes hand in hand with tackling backlog, which is what's driving the use of that accommodation. Keen to work together with the government to think about how to get efficient, accurate decision making into the system. And there's a need for more resources from the outset to make sure that we're kind of streamlining decision making, and that more resources are going into those more complex cases. So making sure that everything is tied up to get those outcomes faster. Also welcome the end of policy to send people to Rwanda, and we believe the government should process the claims of people arriving in the UK here in the UK. And we've kind of already touched again on expanding safe routes, which is something I wanted to kind of talk about. We've already heard about how the government is focused on tackling the supply side, policy challenged by smashing the gangs, to use the government's language, but expanding safe routes can help to reduce the demand that's relied upon by those gangs. So there's kind of two sides of the coin here. And everyone in this room will know all too well the dangerous journeys that people are making across the channel. But the reality is that that's the last step in a long and dangerous journey across many countries, and safe routes, expanding safe routes, offer an opportunity to reduce those journeys and the risks they pose. They're not the whole solution, but they certainly have a role to play here. And we know that we're still going to continue to see war, conflict and persecution in terms of people being displaced and needing to move. So the more we can expand safe routes, the more we can take a humanitarian approach. I think I'm probably nearly out of time. I've looked up by the chair. I think those are some of the immediate challenges. Of course, we also think that the government should be taking a root and branch approach to kind of really looking at the whole asylum system, looking at all of the things that have already been touched on, and really thinking about how to kind of move beyond to those problems.
Brilliant, Vivian, thank you very much. I'm struck what you just said there about the tiny amount of money that people have to live on £1.27 a day. That is so far removed from the sort of misinformation that's put out there about how people are rolling, like living the high life. The gap between the sort of that disinformation and the reality is really, really stark. Well, let's now hear from Marley Morris from the IPPR. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much. Yes, I mean, obviously, much has been said already, and I'll try not to repeat any of the comments made and actually focus more on the future and what we think should change about the current system. But let me just briefly touch on the point on inheritance, which I think is really important because there are some fundamental problems that the new government faces as it's come into power. And I say this, not from a party political perspective, but just looking at the system as the government comes in, it's a system that's frankly been in complete crisis. We see a backlog, as was said, of over 118,000 people by the end of June this year. The cost of the asylum system in the financial year 2022-2023 was nearly £4 billion. And actually, it's gone up since then, and a huge amount of that is driven by the high cost of hotels. And the Rwanda scheme, we estimated at IPPR that the cost was up to £230,000 per person. To send someone to Rwanda, far more expensive than simply processing their claims in the UK. So a kind of shocking inheritance in many ways. And one of the core reasons behind this inheritance is that the government, as Tony said, the government simply stopped making claims or making decisions on claims in the past few months. It simply stopped making decisions on claims from the 7th of March onwards. And if you think about that, it's extraordinary. I mean, if you think the NHS stopped treating people in hospitals, or if the DWP stopped providing financial support to people in need, and there'd be absolute uproar. This is the equivalent of what's happened in the asylum system. Decisions simply to stop being made whatsoever, regardless of their merit. So it's really important that has been changed since the government have come in, and they are now making those decisions again. And of course, actually, the last government increased the number of decision makers, and so now we've actually got a large number of people making decisions. And hopefully that means that the backlog starts to come down. And of course, that is the driver of a lot of the costs that are mounted in the current system. But I'd say there are three key things that the government needs to do going forward to really get to grips with the current crisis in the system. The first of all is fixing the foundation. So part of that, of course, is making decisions, as I just said, but also decisions need to be made fairly, need to be made quickly, and they need to be made accurately. Now, clearly, it's going to take time to get through the existing backlog, but there are lessons to be learned from how the last government got through what they call the legacy backlog of older claims. They got through that backlog quite quickly, actually, through a number of different approaches. One was what they called streamlined asylum processing. Now, it wasn't perfect, there were definitely challenges involved, but the principle of focusing on claims from high grant countries, or countries that are highly likely to have well-founded claims, is, I think, a really sensible one, and will help to speed through those claims, which are very likely to be granted status, in which then you can allow people to move out of temporary asylum accommodation, be able to work and to get on with their lives. I think that's really important to be able to start getting the system under control. The second key area for us is around reimagining asylum accommodation. So, of course, the costs, as I mentioned before, are huge, and hotels are now estimated to cost £3.1 billion per financial year. And of course, a huge amount of that is eating into the ODA budget as well, and having impact for international development. So this is a huge cost for the government in multiple ways. So we think a new approach is needed. The contracts are coming to an end in 2029. There's a break clause in 2026. And I just say three key areas where we think change is needed. First of all, we need to move people out of hotels and into much more appropriate dispersal accommodation, a system which had been in operation up until the last 5 years, and until this explosion of the use of hotels. That's really important. That will get the costs down and will be more appropriate accommodation for people. We need higher standards. We've done a report, working on a report on this at the moment, and it's shocking, frankly, the standards that we've seen in some accommodation, the testimony from people who have experienced that accommodation, and the lack of safeguarding in place for people. And thirdly, local involvement on the ground across the country, whether it's local government, whether it's communities, getting people directly involved in how accommodation is provided, we think is really important too. The final area for us is around pathways to integration, and this really links to the accommodation piece as well. So for those granted status, and actually up until recently, most people have been granted refugee status. We had quite high grant rates up until recently. We need a holistic, a community-based approach to integration. So bringing together different provision, whether it's English language support, employability support, health, including mental health, particularly crucial for people who have, in many cases, experienced extreme trauma, and other types of services, bringing that together, working directly with the voluntary community sector, who often deeply embedded in their communities and know the people who are going to the system well, and having a coordinated approach, I think as Chris was kind of hinting at, across different refugee routes. So you're not having this fragmented system, one system for Hong Kongers, one system for Ukrainians and for Afghans and so on, but you're having this coordinated approach across the system. And if you do all these things, you get a win-win. You get improved integration and support for people in the asylum system. You get save money for the taxpayer and control these ridiculous costs. And actually, you get strengthened communities too. You get greater support for the system among local people across the country. So we think this is a win-win, and hoping that the government will take action in the coming months.
Lovely, thank you very much. Take some questions in a moment. I just wanted to ask the panel, just picking up on something that Marley said towards the end, just one question I'd like to put to the panel to get your views on. Look, you know, Marley has made a very good argument for why, and Chris and everyone, about how it's so important to get people out of hotels. And I suppose the question that I often get from my listeners is, where will that accommodation be? Because, you know, when you speak to lots of local council leaders, they want to be able to take people, but they are really struggling with accommodation. You rightly don't want to be putting people in things like maybe Stockholm or anything like that. But on a practical level, we want to get people, we do want to get people out of hotels for moral reasons, for health reasons, for cost reasons. Where can we put them?
Well, I mean, I thought that the local authority used to do it years ago before they introduced contracts for these companies that make loads of money out of really bad accommodation, which is what we've seen, and it's got worse and worse and worse. I mean, I've done cases about delays in giving people asylum accommodation, and it's just ridiculous. I mean, the standard is absurd. And so, I mean, it was asked in a sort of prep note for this thing, and what about the local authority? I mean, well, that what happened before, but it wouldn't be, I would think, beyond the wit of man to try and do something along those lines again. Marley has been saying. I mean, obviously, the devil's going to be in the detail, and there is so much money that is spent on asylum accommodation, as I said at the start. The portion of that 6 billion is asylum accommodation. That while there are obviously massive pressures on local authorities, some of that money went to the local authority to perhaps have their own now, to perhaps run their own to increase the stock that they have. There's all sorts of possibilities.
So more money to local authorities, ring fence for housing for asylum seekers. Do you think that that's a good idea? Do you think that the politics of that will play out?
Yes.
If there's a tight fiscal climate?
Yes, I think that we're in the challenge you've got is you need to get people off the backlog to liberate the money, but you can't liberate the money until they're off the backlog. So you've got, it's like a chicken and an egg scenario. And I think there's a couple of things to think about. First of all, the work we're talking about is, do we give them accommodation before their asylum decision? Those are two different categories. So the challenge is you clear the backlog very quickly, and these people then present to the local authority as, for mainstream housing provision. We know that like one of the big sort of controversies around migrant integration is when they're perceived to jump housing lists for local authority accommodation, and there is no local authority accommodation. My local authority, the housing list is something like 6 years or something. I mean, that is really politically a dangerous thing to do. But that's the only way to get these people off the backlog to liberate the money to invest in housing. There's also a challenge of you know, there's two ways you can get off the back of. One is to be recognised as a refugee, but there also is not to be recognised as a refugee. And in that case, we do have to remove them from the country. We've actually been pretty poor under the Conservatives at removing people who don't have the right to be here from that list. And we've got to be really clear with people that that's what's needed. But then I think there's a third point. This is very hard, but I think there's a third point that we've got to remember progressives bring to this. And there's like a great quote from Madeleine Albright that I think about a lot on asylum policy. So Madeleine Albright, the former US Secretary of State, left Czechoslovakia with her family in the Holocaust. And they first of all came to London, and then later they moved to America. And Madeleine Albright said, when refugees arrived in Britain, we said, you're welcome, how long will you stay? And when refugees arrived in America, they said, you're welcome, how long till you become a citizen? And I think we do have to think about like our whole systemic attitude to these people, because actually the question isn't where do we put them? The question is how quickly do we turn them into integrated, performing, economically viable, but also full members of society, and speeding that process up without inflaming social tensions or disintegrating council budgets any further is a big challenge facing the government. And I mean, there are things we can start doing, but that's not an easy, I mean, it's a full-term, two-term problem we've got ahead of us.
Yeah, Molly, on those accommodation.
Yeah, no, it's a really good question. It's the key challenge in a way. I think, well, one proposal that is being discussed is, you know, the reality is that the hotel costs are extraordinary. And so what you need is to expand the availability of temporary accommodation. Now, you could use some of the money which is currently being spent on hotels to use it as a capital subsidy for local authorities or housing associations to buy up more, much cheaper temporary accommodation, which would be far cheaper for them to do. It would expand the total amount of affordable accommodation you've got. And it could be used for multiple reasons, and not just people in the asylum system, but other people who might need temporary accommodation, who are homeless, and in the long run could actually just fall into the overall social housing stock, and that would expand the social housing stock for everyone. So I think you could again have this win-win scenario where you are using the money that's currently being wasted in hotels to expand the available affordable accommodation that's out there. You know, the politics are tricky, but I do think as a way to reduce the cost significantly, there is actually a solution. This doesn't need to be this way.
Interesting. So a lot of consensus that taking some of that money that's used for hotels and dedicating that, ring fencing that specifically, but are acknowledging that, you know, what politics is, you know, is always difficult. And Ruby, what do you think?
I'm not sure about a huge amount more to add, but I do think that the points have been made around looking at this holistically in terms of our housing system. So kind of in a way, like there's a lot of commonality in terms of the challenges around accommodation for lots of people in the population.
I mean, it's the issue of ID, right?
Exactly, and we've seen some really interesting kind of innovations if we think about the UK's response to Ukrainian people arriving in the UK. So there's some interesting options that they're trying.
I think on something that Chris said, you know, said that. Yes, the feedback that Chris has suggested. I suspect maybe many people in the room don't like Chris has suggested feedback. But then Chris made the point that the uncomfortable part of what the government is doing is the fact that there will have to be returns. And actually, I think the government has actually accelerated the rate of returns. They haven't really sort of, you know, shouted from the rooftops about it. But how do you feel about the government being clear that they are going to return more people? Do you think there's a humane way of doing it, or is the whole issue of returns always just very, you know, difficult and contested?
I think it is very difficult. I think it's really important to have fairness, transparency in the decision-making process. I think that's really at the heart of a lot of what we've been talking about is public confidence in the system. So I think there's a real need to have transparency around decision-making and absolutely compassion and a humanitarian approach wherever people are in inconsistent.
And if this new government did it's like we're getting trolled by like a gun salute next to us. If this government did significantly increase the rate of returns, how would you feel? How would you feel about that? Resolution?
I can't really comment more than I already have about the need for kind of compassionate and a humanitarian approach, and a fair and transparent kind of approach to decision making, and kind of expanding kind of safety and dignity. So,
Well, look, let's open. I'm sure loads of you have got questions. Whoa. Wow. It was like, hey, wow, questions. Okay, we're gonna take. Oh my god. Okay, does anyone not have a question? Maybe that's easy. This is good. Right. We'll try and get these many questions. Please do keep them really, really short. Don't do that thing. Not so much a question, more an observation, and then do like a massive speech. Please do that. Okay, we'll start in this corner first. Let's start with the lady at the front. We'll do them in batches of 3. Give us your name.
I'm Barbara Twinney and I'm from Altrincham and Sayre West. First Labour MP ever. I remember back to the Kosovan situation. I was a social worker in our local authority. I won't make this too long, but they worked very, very well with the Kosovan community. They had people coming up from London and interpreting. They used old nurses' homes that weren't being used anymore as flats, and gradually they moved out into flats in the community. They got all the children into school, or they actually schooled them there in the nurses' home. You know, they had play areas, and it was fantastic. And we were allowed time out of our work time, a couple of hours a week, to go and actually help, you know, with processing, talking, supporting, you know.
Barbara, I'm going to oh, lovely, great, okay. Well, that's great.
And the other thing is, what about people who have qualifications for jobs that we really, really
Yeah,
need?
great.
Should they be allowed to work immediately?
Yeah, great. Brian is here. You know, yeah.
Olivia Nicole, CEO, Work Rights Centre, we provide employment and immigration legal advice. Chris, Tony, congratulations. You said we need to think about the immigration system in the whole. Perhaps we can talk about work migration for a second, because unfortunately that's another toxic legacy you inherited from the previous government. Reports of labour exploitation are absolutely soaring. I think we can agree that the system you inherited is bad for workers and is bad for businesses as well. Do you agree that this is an urgent problem that this government needs to address? And when might we see that?
Excellent, lovely. Lady in the green just there, yeah.
Hi, Manolina Rutkowski, Die Welt. I'm UK correspondent. I would like to direct my questions towards the 2 members of parliament. What do you think about the returns agreement with the EU, as in the EU taking back migrants that cross the channel, something that the Prime Minister has suggested last year himself? And what could the UK offer the EU in order to reach this deal?
Okay, let's do those first 3. Right, I think, okay, on allowing people to work, Molly, I'll come to you first on that. We can keep our answers reasonably brief, panels, so we've got so many to get through.
Yeah, I think I'd support absolutely reducing the length of time that people can wait to work, at least down to 6 months. I think we support, and also expanding the list of occupations, because one of the problems at the moment is that the list of occupations which people can work in is linked to the immigration salary list, which used to be the short occupation list, and that doesn't make sense anymore. There's no obvious reason why it should be linked. It's a list that's designed for a completely different purpose, so that doesn't make any sense, and I think it's definitely something to look at.
Okay, and then we'll take the lady's question on work expertise.
Exploitation, just get the forces of exploitation get stronger and stronger. And coming to the asylum, or whether it's people who come on a domestic worker visa or whatever else, the system is currently unfortunately set up to lock in exploitation, and I agree with that.
Chris, why don't you take the question of Lady in the Green about the EU returns agreement?
Yeah, so I think that there's yeah, just very quickly on the work
Yeah,
migration, sorry.
yeah.
But I think that the work migration thing is so important, and actually this is why it's really important to see migrants not as a separate category of people in the country, but as part of the workforce. And when you like part of the thing about labour is when you deal with working people, a big group of people who are working in the jobs that we're targeting that at are the migrants. And I think there's been a huge issue in I mean, first of all, Tony's point about exploitation is absolutely right. Need enforcement of exploitation, but also enforcement of things like the minimum wage and trade union rules and those kind of things. We've really seen those go away, but that'll be a huge impact. And then it'll be beneficial for society as well. Part of the reason we've had the challenges we've had in public confidence is because of the precarious employment system, which migrants themselves get caught up in. And then on the returns agreement with the EU, I mean, there are so many legacies of the last government that we should start revisiting. I spent 4 years working as the migration attaché at the British Embassy in Paris, and there are lots of like actually quite technical types of agreements, like sharing information on criminal records, things like PRUM, things like the SIS database. Obviously, the Dublin system we're now out of, but there are the Dublin system, I would argue, actually is becoming quite outdated as it is, and we do need to work like in the round, and that includes. I mean, I think someone made the point that the French border is the last step of a very, very long journey, and I think we have to be going the whole way back through that journey with migrants and working with every interlocutor, every sort of stakeholder group that you find at those different points, whether that be in Europe or outside Europe. That's a big ask, but I would argue that they will maybe really start to see the real changes.
So you're saying that you think the way to solve this is eventually finding some way to sort of work out some EU return agreement?
Yeah, it could be together with the EU, it could be with third countries beyond the EU. I mean, the part is just about getting into the real detail. There's some real technical tinkering that could be done with a lot of the EU instruments or international instruments that the EU getting back involved with would start to have an impact on the different kinds of rules, I think.
Okay,
Right,
right.
it's actually a really quick
Yeah,
point.
very
Quickly, so the question about working, I mean, Labour's big thing on skills was to say we need to join up the right to work and skilled migrants, except with migrants with skills policy generally, and that is a big change that's going to be put in place. We're not returns agreement stuff yet. I mean, kind of Dublin Part 2 is where we're heading.
Interesting. Okay, let's go to the back of the room and we'll get some data. If you just again give us your name, very brief question. Thank you.
Hi, Jess from Citizens UK.
Hi, Jess.
Chris, really building on your kind of beautiful quote there, as well as fixing the immigration, the asylum system, I wonder if there's an opportunity here for Labour to champion a smoother, fairer pathway to citizenship for those who put down roots in the UK.
Great question. The gentleman there, yeah.
Thanks, Seb, from the University of Birmingham. Picking up on the First Lady's point about giving asylum seekers the right to work, are we not missing a trick in terms of that also having an impact on housing later on? If they're already earning an income, then they don't need to go into the social housing or onto the waiting list, right? So let's think about this holistically. Right to work would impact accommodation probably as well.
Yeah, good, excellent point. And then gentleman, then the striped shirt, yeah.
Thank you. Congratulations to both MPs. My name is Eddie Aigbe. I'm with Citizens UK as well, and I'm the senior project manager with the NRPF partnership. And my question, of course, is on NRPF. For those of you that don't know, it's the no recourse to public funds policy. So there has been a lot of talk in conference about ending child poverty and tackling homelessness, but we need to address the NRPF to do what? So what are the possibilities of addressing NRPF or ending it? Because it's impacting over 1 million people in this country.
Very, particularly women. Domestic abuse or exploitation and things like that. Okay, three great questions. Wimi, I'll come to you about sort of a smoother path to citizenship. Or Chris, you want to, why don't you do that one? You do that one, yeah.
So I think your point about citizenship is absolutely right. And actually, I wrote a report when I worked for IPPR 10 years ago about this exact topic, which I really should reread at some point. But I think you're right that actually in Britain, unlike other countries, we've been pretty agnostic about whether people who come here eventually become citizens. And in many ways, there are good reasons for that. You know, quite good. One of the few good legacies of empire in many ways was Britain's ability to say, well, as long as you're here and contributing, we don't mind if you're a citizen or not. But especially in the post-Brexit reality, I think it has made a difference. So I think if we do what the last Labour government did look at incentivising citizenship in a very different, political context, but I think that it would be a good idea for the new one to start looking at that too. Part of the issue is citizenship doesn't really bring a lot of different rights for someone beyond voting if they're not from the Commonwealth. Basically, you can get all those rights before with leave to remain, with permanent leave to remain. So there's a question of do we want to create further rights that come in that tier of citizenship? That's a big debate. But also the cost of citizenship has become really significant. And we're using that to fund other parts of the Home Office. We've just spoken about the massive financial challenges in the Home Office. I am not proposing that we lower the fees right now because we cannot possibly afford that, the backlog. But it's something that further on with our crisis, we should definitely look at.
Great, thanks, Chris. I mean, why don't you take Seb's question about work and housing?
Yeah, just a really quick response to that. I was just going to say that I think this just goes back to the kind of need to take a whole approach, and actually what we need is some integration strategies that look at all of these issues. And going back to one of the things you said right at the beginning, Aisha, around the role of devolved governance, I think there's something there to be thinking about different approaches across the UK. In terms of integration, a lot of that is not necessarily the responsibility of Westminster.
And so I think that there are other parts of the country that would like to have more, like Scotland has got, it is very much from an economic kind of point of view, like they need skills and all of that kind of thing. No recourse to public funds, but do you want to pick that up?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, very much support on the points you made. I think we've been particularly concerned about the impacts of NRPF for a long time, IPPR, in particular the impacts of the 10-year route for people, because it's a route which people face if they otherwise it's kind of default route they may face if they otherwise aren't successful to get onto a 5-year family route. And so they fall onto that route and it becomes extremely expensive. They have to pay fees every 2.5 years. They have no recourse to public funds as a default for those 10 years. And then after the 10 years, they have to pay a settlement. And if they can't pay, then they continue on that route. And often are in extremely precarious circumstances. And again, it particularly affects women and single mothers in particular. So it has a real impact on child poverty as well. So NRPF absolutely needs reform. We've made a number of proposals about how to change the system. But one thing we propose in particular is just to make there's currently a way to lift the NRPF condition, the change of conditions. And I think ways to make that process smoother, easier to apply in more cases would be a really important step to help people who are at risk of destitution because of this policy.
Great, well, time to take more questions. Let's take some from this side. We'll come to the lady in the middle. Let's do this lady here, this lady here, then the lady at the back. Yeah. First, again, name, just very brief question, please. We're very scintillating, but I could see, I was thinking, I think we're going to lose that woman. I was like, sleeping or dead. I think.
My name is Josephine and I work for Migrants' Rights Charitable Praxis. And my question is about the digitalisation process and how worried you are about the transition to a digital-only immigration system and what that's going to do to people who will find themselves unable to prove their rights in the UK from the 31st of November this year.
Great question, thank you. And then make it the front here. Yeah.
Hi, my name's Deirdre Fox. I stood as an MP in July. Ultimately, I was unsuccessful, I'm afraid. However, it meant I spent Solihull, Westminster, reduced the majority from 22.5 to 4. However, it meant I spent a lot of time on doorsteps. This is a slightly different question. A lot of time on doorsteps. I was concerned, horrified at the changing narrative that is taking root, particularly in young people, around immigrants are bad. And therefore, how do we start? There's a lot of really technical stuff that needs to be done and great work by some of the new MPs, I think. But how do we start to change that narrative ahead of that work landing? Because it really needs to.
Really, really great question. And there's a lady in the green at the back.
Hello, congrats to the both MPs for getting elected. My name is Theo Benny. I'm a local councillor in Brent, and also I have a charity called Social Equity Centre where we're training first generation migrants to get jobs in the public sector, and also been working with Migrant Democracy Project to get more first generation migrants in local council, so encouraging them to stand for elections. My questions for the both MPs is, considering that in this moment in time, there's no voting rights guaranteed for people that are coming to this country after Brexit. And obviously you have, you know, Scotland and Wales, which have kept the residence-based voting rights, but England and Northern Ireland hasn't. What is the Labour government going to do about that? And how can we help upskill migrants and also increase representation in public sector? Thank you so much.
It's really important question, because I mean, I think this is a really huge issue that you've tapped on into. You just look at what happened with the riots, and actually a number of really young people involved. There's a very dark force, I think, amongst a lot of young people. Social media is feeling that. And I'll come to you. What are your thoughts on changing that narrative of young people and in schools?
Absolutely, I think there's no kind of single easy solution to this, but I think there is, it's really interesting what you're saying about what you hear on the doorstep. I think there's also a range of views that aren't necessarily at the fore in public discourse. So there's something about which voices are heard, which voices are amplified in media and social media. And in terms of the Red Cross, we do quite a lot of work in terms of our own channels and our own communications work in trying to put humanity at the centre. It kind of risks sounding a little bit trite, but actually, we're talking about men, women, and children here. We're talking about people who are just like us, people who have very challenging, difficult situations. So I think there's something there about really building understanding, and going back to what you were saying about £1.27, the number I use, the kind of the gap between some of the discourse and the facts, and how we can help organisations like the Red Cross can help as a neutral voice in shaping.
And just to add to that, there's a really interesting story in the Mirror a couple of weeks ago. It was a front page splash on the number of racist incidents in schools and the number of young children who are being excluded. And I did an interview with a really good organisation called Teacher Tab, which basically sort of surveys teachers every day, and I spoke to their founder. And they were saying that, look, one of their suggestions is sort of dealing with this, because a lot of this is coming obviously from the parents, it's coming from home. Instead of excluding these children, because if you exclude sort of these children, then you're probably going to push them further. So actually, they were kind of suggesting they've done pilots where the teachers had offered these children sort of extra classes, trying to explain and educate them, and they'd actually found that they'd had some sort of success. I know, that is a bit kumbaya, but it's very hard. This stuff's got to be looked at. Marley, why don't you pick up Josephine's really interesting question about this moving to digital only system?
Yeah, I mean, I think obviously it's a concern. We think it's a concern. There's obviously parallels with the Windrush scandal, with the shift towards a new system, people falling through the cracks, people not being able to prove their status. And of course, we know that many of the aspects of the hostile environment, now the compliant environment, are still in place. So may face the trouble being able to prove their right to work, their right to rent, and so on. And of course, we also know with the move to the EU settled status, that the digital reliance there faced lots of actual technical problems. People weren't able to prove their status because they weren't able to log onto the app, or there was some kind of technical problem which meant that they couldn't demonstrate their status, or there were problems with the landlords and employers as well being able to access the required technical knowledge and software. So I think there are lots of practical issues here. It feels like an obvious thing. I think from a Home Office perspective, from civil service perspective, they think, oh, this is obvious, we need to move to a digital perspective. But I think again, it's about understanding what does this look like for people on the ground. And again, I think reflecting on the Wendy Williams lessons learned review, this is an area where big policy change and a real risk. I should say, of course, it's something that the government inherited. It was all in train, so it's difficult for them because it's coming right down the line for them. But thinking about where there could be major risks and scandals in the coming months, and that could go under the radar, this is actually potentially one of them. So it's definitely one I think to monitor very carefully to see how it rolls out in practice.
We wouldn't want to have another Windrush sort of situation for so many people. It's a visible documentation. That's really glad you raised that. Right, final question from our wonderful councillor from Brent up to the two MPs looking at sort of voting rights and upskilling. Julie.
I will answer that, but I just wanted to say really quickly about narrative. We've got to do two things. We've got to address the socio-economic problems and lead people to point the finger at environment. We've got to change the narrative by putting a counter narrative, which is not afraid to say that there can be and are positive benefits from immigration. That's two fundamental things. That's who we are. In terms of the voting rights point, I actually thought this was a policy to give voting for those who are here indefinitely remain European citizens. That's not happening subsequently. I didn't actually know that. One might say there's an inconsistency. I'll be happy to.
After Brexit, they don't have the same rights. This is the problem.
They have.
And you don't have a level playing field anymore. So if you live in Scotland, you have the right. If you live in England, you don't have the right. So it's very disproportionate.
Yes, so 2 points I would make. So I think just picking up on Joan's point about that massive challenge that we face among the young is absolutely something I noticed in my campaign, particularly young men. It's really gender split now, I think, in a way that the kind of hostility to immigration wasn't in older generations. There is just, you have to be able to firstly need to address the deep challenges of the immigration system. If you haven't addressed that, there will always be an appetite or critique. But then you've also got to be able to, as Tony says, to put the argument that immigration is beneficial to the country. Like Sundar is here from British Future, they've done great work on that. But I think there's something about people will only buy that argument. Like I always compare immigration policy to economic policy. If the market loses confidence in the government's economic policy, everything falls apart basically. If the people lose confidence in the government's ability to get the immigration system under control, they're not going to listen to any of the other arguments. It's the game's a whole game. So you need to be able to present that you have got the system under control. And then on the final point about voting rights, really this question of citizenship is an interesting corollary here. Actually, one of the few benefits of citizenship is full voting rights. But so do we want to restrict that to citizens or expand it beyond it? And I think one of the things that's been dead interesting if you look at as the UK becomes very much more diverse than it used to be, especially outside the big cities, is the representation of different migrant groups is very different. Poles are much less represented than Pakistanis and Bangladeshis. And we haven't thought about what's driven that, or if there are structural obstacles that we're putting in place of certain groups. And I think it's really important as a final point because we can talk about the national level policies on immigration or asylum policies and stuff, but actually immigration is felt locally in local communities. And if you don't have local buy-in and engagement with the exact policies that are being put in place, you will lose people. And so we really need to put those decisions and practices in that sort of local area.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, we've come to the end of our time. Hope you've enjoyed it. We've all experienced what it's like being a menopausal woman in we've all learned, we've all shared an experience. Give up my brilliant panel.